Percival Ricketts. Everybody calls me Percy.
Okay, Percy. And what year were you born? When were you born? What year?
I was born in 1955, so I'm an older guy.
Okay, so in the
Yeah.
50s.
Yes.
And where did you grow up during your childhood years?
Okay, so I was born in Jamaica.
Mhm.
I went to high school in Jamaica, and I came here to the United States to attend college. I
Mhm.
did my undergrad at Virginia Tech. Then I
Mhm.
went back home, and then later, actually, in 1990 was when I came back to the United States. But I
Ah,
grew
okay.
up. I grew up in Jamaica,
Mhm.
rural Jamaica.
And then about how old were you when you moved to the United States from Jamaica?
About 35. I came here in my 30s.
Oh, okay, so you spent the majority of your life, well, your early part of your life in Jamaica.
The early part, yes, up
Hmm.
until high school. Then I lived in South America for a while, and I've traveled all over the world. I've
Hmm.
done quite a few things in my childhood. But when I came back here, I was in my mid 30s. Yeah.
Okay, and then you said you were in rural Jamaica.
Yes.
And what
Um,
was like the biggest, more populous area where you were from in Jamaica? Like, what would be the nearest big city, so to speak?
so it's right in the middle. Jamaica is divided into parishes, 14 parishes. And the one that I'm from is called Clarendon. And the capital of Clarendon is Maypen. So that's the biggest town. And that's where I went to high school, primary school and high school.
Ah, okay, okay. And then that leads us into the next question. Can you describe, when you think back to your childhood friends, before you went into elementary school or grade school, how would you describe your friends? What colors, boys and girls, shapes and sizes? What was the makeup of your childhood friends?
Okay, so Jamaica, not unlike many Caribbean countries, um, is about 90 plus percent black.
Okay.
So when I grew up in rural Jamaica, there was one white man in the town, one white family
Hmm.
who were descendants of slave owners. He had an estate. Uh, in the neighborhood where I grew up, though, we call them districts. In my district, there was not one white person. So I grew up around neighbors, relatives who looked like me. They were
Okay.
all black.
Hmm.
And when I went to elementary school, all black. Well, from kindergarten, we called it basic school. Everybody was black like me, and
Wow.
it wasn't until I went to high school at 11 plus.
Right.
That's when we go to high school in Jamaica. That
Hmm.
I had a close encounter with white people.
Hmm.
But you see, Jamaica has the motto there is out of many one people. There are white people, there are black people, there are Chinese, there are Indians, and it's from a historical point of view.
Right.
After the slaves, after black people were emancipated, when they were set free, then the Indians came and the Chinese came and the Syrians came. So there are all kinds of people in Jamaica. A lot of them, though, tend to live in towns. So like
Okay.
me, I grew up in the rural areas. I didn't have much exposure to white people per se.
Hmm. Had you heard any stories, or it just never came up because just where you grew up, everyone was just, you know, black Jamaican, and you just never really heard any stories about other colors of people? Did you hear about any stories about white people at that point when you were a child?
Oh, absolutely. I consider myself to be very fortunate. In the district where I grew up, for example, there was no electricity. And so we had one radio that we would sit around at night and we would listen to the radio. Of course,
Ah.
the radio signed off at midnight. But I was one of those fortunate people who is from a big family on
Hmm.
both sides, both on my father's side and on my mother's side. And at one point, there were about five centenarians in my family. A lot of people, they live very long.
Wow.
And so my grandmothers, and especially my grandmothers, they would sit around, they would get all the grandchildren together, and they would tell us what life was like for them when they were children. And a lot of them, their grandparents told them about slavery and the kind of abuses that they went through, and so on. So that rich history that we sat around and we listened to gave you some perspective of what their lives were like going way, way back. Yes. Yeah. So we did hear stories about slavery and how white people used to treat black people and so on.
Okay. And then when you think back to your childhood, do you remember any childhood games that you and your friends would play, or you and your brothers and sisters or relatives that were your age? What types of childhood games, or just what do you remember as being fun when you were a child and growing up?
Well, from we were very young, childhood games like hide and go seek. Most young kids are familiar with that. And then as we grow older as boys, we would play cricket. Cricket is not popular here in the United States. But we used to listen on the radio, and you can hear when the West Indies cricket team was playing Pakistan or India, or yeah. And so it's mainly soccer, what we call football. You call soccer here. So soccer and cricket were two of the most popular ones that we used to play. Yeah.
Okay. And then that leads us into the next question. Now, what is your earliest memory of someone pointing out to you that there's a major difference between being, a black person or a person of color, and comparing that to a white person, where someone made it a real big point to say, hey, this person is different from that person, or you're different from that person? What was
Well,
your earliest memory?
Jamaica, the number one industry there is tourism. So if you live like on the north coast, on the coast, you see white people all the time because tourists come from all over the world. However, if you're from like where I'm from, it's not unusual for people to grow up very old until they're very old, and they might not have had any kind of encounter with a white person. They're just not there.
Right.
Yeah. Nobody really pointed it out to me. I thought about that when I went to high school, though. As I said before, was my first encounter with other colored people. You see the Chinese, you see light-skinned Indians. There were some white kids, and so you see that they're different from the people who you grew up with. But to say somebody pointed it out, to say you're different from those people or so on. Nobody did that.
That's interesting. Very interesting.
Yeah. Jamaica has a very interesting history when it comes to black people. Because I grew up in a situation where the prime minister, my doctor, all my teachers look like me, I didn't see it as a handicap in any way. It wasn't until I came here and I went to Virginia Tech. That's where I did my undergrad. And I learned about racism in the South. And that's when my African American friends would tell me what it was like for them, to grow up, and stories that they heard from their parents. And I really couldn't relate. It's because my history, what I was told, what I know, is totally different.
Right.
Yeah.
And then as you came into the United States, and then you went through college and you started to get into your work life, can you think of any stories where someone attempted to judge you by your color, or you just it probably maybe didn't affect you because you just didn't see it that way, or you didn't grow up that way?
I remember, Kevin, the first time I heard the word minority. honestly, I was in college and I didn't know what it meant. Somebody, and I remember there was a white guy who asked me, what I thought it was like to be at Virginia Tech based on affirmative action. I didn't know what that was either, because in high school in Jamaica, it was inculcated into us that if you work hard, if you get an education, you can go places. And so I had to do my own research. What's a minority? What's affirmative action? And I really got into African American history. And that taught me how we were similar and how we were different. That was the first time when I was in college that I got exposed to racism.
How do you see the future when you look back? How you grew up, how you came to the United States. Um, you see the impact that race and racism has in America. How do you see the future playing out?
To be honest, Kevin, I'm worried about the future. When I compare stories that I've heard about the role that race had played in the United States before I got here, during the civil rights movement, and even before then, it's worrisome. Of course, nowadays we find people kneeling when the national anthem is being played. A lot of black men and boys are being killed, and people are just outraged, and it's almost like we're going back in time. In my role as a psychotherapist, my perspective is even different, because I listen to the stories of a lot of my black brothers who come for therapy because of racial incidents that they have been a part of, and the way they feel. And a lot of times, well, one of the problems that I find we have is that a lot of people who need counseling, they don't trust the system, so to speak. And so they tend to feel a lot more comfortable when they come to somebody like me for counseling, even though I'm not from here, I wasn't born here, but they know that I can relate to what they say. Because if I'm walking down the street, I look just like another black man, even until I speak. That's when people recognize that, oh, Americans like to say, he has an accent. But in fact, we all have accents. That's what distinguishes one set of people from the other. If an African American, even a white American, goes to Europe, for example, when they speak, they can, oh, you're American. That's what distinguishes that person from other people. So until I speak, they don't know that I'm not African American. But we black people, we are in the same boat when it comes to race and racial challenges that we face. And like I say, I listen to this story. We human beings are very peculiar beings. We tend to have curiosities about things that are different, people that are different. And nothing is wrong with that. That's how we learn about the world, right? But when we start treating people as if they're subhuman and we discriminate against them, it's a problem. And nowadays, like I said, there's a resurgence, there's outrage, because years after the civil rights, decades after the civil rights movement and so on, we find ourselves going back in time where people have to demonstrate and get on the streets and do all kinds of things to get the attention that people like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Had fought for such a long time. And in 2020, in the 21st century, we find ourselves still haven't gotten much further. I mean, in terms of race relations in this country, I think it's appalling. it doesn't matter what we achieve, I think, as a people, as long as there's a disconnect in terms of how we relate to each other. I think that we have taken 3 steps forward, we take 2 backwards, because we cannot get along. It's amazing, even now during the pandemic, how people come together when there's a war, the way we can relate with each other as Americans in defense of America. It's I'm really worried about the future, about people who look like me, black boys in particular, and the way they find the way they're going to find themselves into this world and contribute. A few do make it, a few, but the majority of our people are really suffering because of the way we're viewed, because of the way we're treated. And like I say, I get to listen to the stories, and I try to help people to develop coping skills to deal with some of the challenges that they face just because of their race, their color. And I have to be careful how I say white people, because sometimes when we talk in global terms, we kind of convey the idea that it's all white people or all black people, and that's not true. But a lot of times you hear, oh, black men don't go to the doctor or they don't take care of themselves. It's because of this distrust. And even coming for counseling, they see counselors as part of the system. Because, for example, when they get into trouble, they're court ordered sometimes for therapy. So they see it as a part of their punishment. Sometimes they view therapists and counselors as part of the system. So they're not coming out and they're not going to the doctor because of what happened before. Even now during the pandemic, I hear people tell me, so many people are dying from COVID-19 and they're not planning to take the vaccine because they don't know what's in it. My perspective, not just as a black man, but as a psychotherapist as well, because I listen to so many stories. People come for therapy because of trauma that they have suffered as a result of racism. It brings a different perspective from, I guess, what most people would bring.
Oh, yeah. That brings us to the end. And Dr. Ricketts, thank you very, very much. It's always a pleasure to speak with you. And thank you for taking the time to explore, the different views upon race and racism, looking back at your life, growing up in Jamaica and then bringing it all the way to today's world and then looking into the future. But thank you very much.
Thank you, Kevin, for the opportunity. And be safe, please.
Okay, yes, you too. Thank you again.
Take care. All right.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.